Hello everyone, and welcome to the NewMR Chatbot Experiment, where we'll also be talking about the threats and opportunities facing market research. My name's Sue York, and I'll be your chair for this evening, or this morning, depending on where you are. By way of introduction, I'll be joined by Martin Powton from Wizu. Martin and I will be giving you some feedback on the chatbot experiment that Wizu and NewMR conducted earlier in the year. I'll introduce Martin, who will join me, and we'll take you through some feedback on what we're calling the NewMR Chatbot Experiment. In terms of the presentation that Martin and I will be running through today, we're going to give you an outline to the project. We'll talk about the look and the feel of the chatbot experience, and then we'll discuss some of the things that came out of this project. We'll have a look at how intelligent should chatbots be? When would you use a chatbot? And some of the sort of nitty-gritty of running a chatbot experience. Things like conditional responses, how to think about those. Obviously, when you get to the analysis, we've got challenges around collecting open-ended data. And we can look at some other benchmarks, and Martin will be sharing a comparison study that Wizu have done. And we'll finish the presentation by sharing some of the recommendations that we think have come out of this project. So in terms of an outline of a project, there's really two key components to this particular experiment. We conducted some online discussions about chatbots with other researchers. So these predominantly took place in LinkedIn, but we've also picked up comments from other areas. And then the other main component was what we're calling the chatbot survey. So we used the Wizu platform to do that. Ended up with 336 interviews after we did some data cleaning. And this project was conducted in January 2019, had a global sample, but it was a convenient sample of people who are connected to NewMR. So we're not making any broader claims about the representativeness of it. So in terms of the study flow, we started with an introduction to what we were doing. We asked people a few short, what we would call close-ended questions. We asked them what country they came from, what was their organisation in terms of whether they are a buyer or a supplier of research, and then we asked people about their level of optimism about market research. So were they optimistic about it, neutral or pessimistic? And that's when we then branched into the more chatbot experience component of the study, where people were then probed as to why they felt that way, why they felt optimistic or pessimistic or neutral. And then we asked them what they thought were the threats facing market research and insights, and then that was followed up with the chatbot probing them further. And then we asked about what was the main opportunity, and again, those responses were probed. And then there was an opportunity to provide comments on some pre-programmed topics that people had not previously mentioned. And then finally, we gave people the opportunity to provide a comment about either the topic itself, threats and opportunities, or the chatbot survey, chatbot experience itself. So over to you, Martin, to talk about sort of the chatbot look and feel.
So yeah, there was a number of different types of interactions that people had. So first of all, we're going to take a look at a more typical and perhaps a more basic example of how the conversations went. So as you can see in this example here, what seemed to happen here is that the responses were pretty good in terms of providing a good level of detail, but actually what happened here is that the respondent didn't actually mention some of the common topics or areas that we were expecting them to. So in terms of being able to probe for more information, some of those probes weren't triggered just purely based on the content of the responses. So we could have actually set the chatbot to be able to probe around new themes, but in this particular scenario, we felt like we wanted to play relatively safe in terms of how detailed the probing went into. So we tried to avoid that in this scenario, but that is a possibility that it could have gone down. So we have some preset common themes that we're aware of, but also we could have perhaps gone down a path of probing around other areas. We've also got the question here towards the end where we're asking, do you have any comments relating to big data, biometric, etc.? So that's where the kind of more dynamic question came in, that was probing for topics that they hadn't mentioned. So these were some of the common areas we expected people to talk about. So if they'd mentioned that in the previous couple of responses, obviously that's where we would have probed. But if they had mentioned it, we wouldn't have mentioned those topics in this additional follow-up question. So obviously from a respondent's point of view, they're not necessarily seeing that this is more of a dynamic question, but obviously the idea here is to not probe on topics that they've already mentioned, but to try and get some extra feedback. And obviously you can see in this example here that the respondent has actually provided some additional insight around automation that obviously wouldn't have been generated without that particular probe. So now let's take a look at a more kind of interactive example that shows a little bit more about how the chatbot can actually engage a bit more within the conversation. So here, for example, when we've asked about the main threat facing the market research and insights profession, the respondent has just given a kind of a pretty basic one-word answer in terms of automation. So automation happens to be one of the themes that we expected people to talk about. So you can see here that the chatbot has then triggered a follow-up around that. So what it does, as well as looking at whether they've mentioned the topic, it also looks at the complexity of the answer. So if the respondent had said straight off the bat, I believe automation is a threat, and went on to expand on that, then obviously the chatbot doesn't necessarily need to probe for more information. But in this example where they've given a pretty basic response, it makes sense to then ask for more information about why they felt that was a threat. And actually in this scenario, they went on to make some interesting points and provided much more kind of valuable data. You can also see here that the kind of automated dynamic question at the end is not probing for automation as a topic as it did in the previous question. So again, it's looked at what are the topics that have been mentioned and obviously then vary the content. And you can see here actually they do mention the automation comment was related to the artificial intelligence. So that just really highlights in terms of actually it can be quite difficult sometimes to define topics and how certain keyword groups are matched together, which was one of the areas that was interesting looking at this project. But we can also take a look at an example that didn't work quite as well. So obviously the idea here is that we're probing around responses and really pushing to get more information. But in this example, the respondent was leaving quite basic answers, and in most cases they weren't triggering any follow-up questions. And also in the question around the main opportunity, they answered basically a very simple don't know. And in that particular conversation, we were also asking for, do they feel there's any other opportunities? So when they've answered don't know, obviously it doesn't really make sense to ask around other opportunities. And from the respondent's point of view, obviously it felt like they had either already answered that question or that the question wasn't necessary. But obviously, in that kind of scenario, that type of situation can happen in traditional surveys as well as conversational. If people aren't kind of giving particularly good answers or engaging, then obviously that limits the amount that we can do. But obviously it's interesting to look at how a chatbot would be able to kind of try and push and elicit more detail from those responses. But it's finding that balance between being able to push and probe, but obviously not delivering an experience where people feel like they're getting unnecessary questions. So now back to Sue, who's going to talk a little bit more about chatbots in general.
So when we reflect on this project, as well as looking at some of the reactions and conversations that we've had online, there are really two questions that stand out when you're thinking about using chatbots in market research. And those two are around how intelligent should the chatbot be, and for what purpose should we be using chatbots in market research? Now, if we think about the how intelligent question, it's really a spectrum that intelligence would run across when you're thinking about this. So if you think at one end of the spectrum, we could have something that's essentially like a standard survey, but it's in a chattier style. And I think the use cases for things like that around it makes the experience more engaging. You can talk about, the reduction in survey fatigue, but it also still gives us some quality options because we are taking a standardized experience and making it chattier. So, we can draw on some of our experience from survey design. Then if we go up the other end of the spectrum, where we're really talking about an experience that's almost indistinguishable from talking to a human. And the use case for that is really around, depth at scale. So, really intelligent questioning, but being able to happen, to much bigger samples than we would typically use in, say, a qualitative study. Now, when we talk about, the spectrum where we're talking about something that's a standardized experience in a chatty style, people did see benefits to that. It was the survey itself was much more interesting in the chatbot style. People would recommend it. So it looks like there are going to be some gains around engagement in that area. But then we have other people who actually would prefer the idea of an experience that is indistinguishable from a human. And here's a verbatim comment from somebody who's disappointed that it was just, in their view, a standard survey made a bit chattier. They were wanting something much more like a human experience. And obviously this will be something we'll be thinking about, talking about, experimenting with, as we go forward in research. But the really big question that comes out of this is, if we could create chatbots that were indistinguishable from humans, would it be okay not to tell people they were talking to a machine? And I think most people on the line tonight would say, no, we must tell people if they're talking to a machine. And obviously this is something we'll be talking about and debating in terms of our ethical codes going forward. But these are the sorts of topics that we need to be getting to grips with and starting to form views on in terms of ethics, but also how we design our research. So the other big question too is, for what purposes can or should we be using chatbots? And so these are some reflections and some, ideas to start thinking about. How do you feel about these in relation to chatbots? Now, you could take a position that chatbots should mostly be used for qualitative research. Chatbots could be used to make existing surveys more palatable for participants. And then with the thought of, even if they do not produce better data. You could take the view that you should only use chatbots if indeed they do produce better data. Maybe you would take a view that chatbots should only be used at the moment in a minimal viable product or agile way to help develop better platforms and approaches. Or perhaps chatbots should only be used when they're substantially more developed. You may take the view that perhaps they're not yet there yet, we need to keep working on them, and when they're better, we will go with chatbots. So back to Martin to introduce some use cases for chatbots.
Yeah, so there are a number of different scenarios where chatbots can be used, with I think some definitely being more suitable than others. And the strongest cases tend to be where the conversation parameters are perhaps a little bit more predictable. So areas like customer or employee experience, they'll usually have common themes that make it much easier to actually structure the conversation and know what topics will likely be brought up. There's also kind of quite a few scenarios where survey fatigue might be higher, or the risk of actually boring the participant is higher. So, for example, where the actual content or experience might not be the most interesting topic, perhaps by making them more engaging, you'll get obviously better response rates and more interesting kind of reactions. There's also an argument that conversational surveys through chatbots would appeal to a younger audience that might be more likely to have a chat on their mobile through a conversational interface than actually sit down and do a traditional survey. So I think there's a number of scenarios where just kind of making those surveys more interactive, more engaging will lead to higher response rates from what we found, but also just a higher level of engagement. But there's also scenarios where it obviously becomes a little bit more challenging. So I think, for example, when you're exploring new situations or new areas where the potential topics are a little bit more unknown or could cover a wider range of areas, then in those scenarios, it makes it more difficult to be able to set up some kind of automated probing and follow-ups. I think in those scenarios, quite often it'd be useful to have either existing data or to perhaps kind of generate some responses through a kind of initial pilot project that would then help define the scope of the conversation. And that really allows you to predict more of the potential themes. So, I mean, for example, this NewMR study that we've done here, obviously we built this with some kind of ideas in terms of common topics that people might mention, but now we've run this study. Obviously, that would put us in a position to create a much more kind of detailed conversation next time around that would really allow us to kind of delve that little bit deeper. So we did play it safe in terms of the way that we probed and the level of interaction in terms of making it more in depth. But now we've got a better understanding of the types of responses we collect, would be able to set that up much better. Now let's take a look at the value and the danger of these kind of conditional conversations. So in this scenario, some of the participants received a more predictable set of questions. And I think that was due to a combination of the pattern of their answers, so if they're leaving kind of particularly basic responses, but also the fact that we adopted a more conservative approach for this particular scenario. But some of the participants did receive more conditional questioning, and I think when that happened, that did offer a more improved experience. There was more of that kind of two-way interaction. And also did generate better quality data. So where people were leaving basic responses, we were able to really probe and get more detailed data out of that, which makes the information that we're gathering much more valuable. Although obviously it's worth bearing in mind that the conditional fault questions do also introduce the risk of a more flawed interaction, which again is why we try to keep this scenario relatively simple. But there's definitely a trade-off in terms of finding the kind of the sweet spot for these conditional conversations. The more conditional, the more personalized the survey, obviously makes it more engaging and potentially can deliver more detailed insights. But it's also worth keeping in mind that you're still going to be running analysis of that data, so you need to have consistent data points. But also there's the risk that the conditional questions might not work, so you've got to be aware of kind of that trade-off. And it's important, I think, to keep an eye on the results if you are kind of introducing conditional conversations, to be able to make changes as necessary if you are seeing any issues in there. So let's take a look at the kind of the best ways in terms of finding the balance between open and closed questions. So I think if your survey is more of a structured qualitative interview, then the questions are obviously going to be more kind of open-ended, and that it's kind of a more natural open-ended approach for that particular scenario. But if you've got more of a quantitative survey that's quite short, then actually the balance becomes less of an issue. So I think on areas like customer satisfaction, quite often just collecting a couple of overall metrics, but then asking one or two open text questions with the probing is really useful in terms of keeping that survey short and engaging, but actually using the follow-up questions to really get the reasons, the why behind those scores. And that tends to be the kind of the perfect balance, I think, in terms of combining a couple of quantitative and qualitative questions in there. I think some of the kind of key implications around the open ends are really, are participants going to be willing and able to enter responses? Also, how will you turn, if you are collecting more text, how are you going to turn that into numbers to be able to kind of pick out trends and insights? And also, if you are generating numbers from text, how does that actually compare to more traditional surveys? And I think that leads us into just taking a quick look at a recent case study that we did at Wizu. So we did a case study that did a comparison of Wizu conversational surveys and a traditional online survey form. And in that scenario, we used a sample of over 500 responses through each medium and compared the results between those two platforms. And we used a scenario of a kind of a hotel post-stay satisfaction survey, so quite a kind of a simple scenario to be able to look at. What we found when we compared the results between the two platforms is that the Wizu conversational survey actually generated 118% more words than traditional survey forms. So people were actually willing to write a lot more detailed responses through the conversational platform, writing kind of much more detail. But also what we looked at was that data they're providing actually kind of more actionable? So that was really going from people saying, this was good, or I like this, or this was bad, to actually the reasons behind that. So that's the key data in terms of being able to take action from it. And what we found is by using the probing and the conversational kind of interview, that we actually generated 91% more actionable insight. We also looked at the actual survey experience itself and asked people to rate the experience. And what we found is that 57% of conversational respondents rated the experience as 10 out of 10, whereas only 11% actually gave the top score for a traditional form-based survey. So people clearly enjoying actually doing the conversational experience more than the traditional form-based survey. We also looked at demographics. So there is an assumption that actually younger generations would prefer this and that perhaps older generations wouldn't be comfortable. But what we found is that actually across all age ranges and genders, there was a clear preference for conversational surveys over a form-based survey. And we also looked at, would this actually introduce any bias in terms of the core metrics that we were measuring? So in this particular scenario, we used a net promoter score rating. And what we found is that people were actually giving similar results, that there wasn't actually any bias being introduced from the platform. It was just obviously the experience and the additional insight around that where there was the difference. So now I think Sue's going to look at more of the kind of learnings from the particular NewMR project that we were working on.
Yeah, so thanks, Martin. We really just want to kind of put some learnings out there based on this project and how we might approach future projects. So one of the things that came through when we were thinking about some of the issues that Martin's been talking about now with a rear view mirror kind of effect was, when we're talking about, how much should we, have a sort of a more intelligent chatbot, how much should we probe, how much conditional logic should there be in there? We kind of felt that if we'd perhaps done some qualitative research in advance of designing the chatbot, it might have given us a bit more insight into the sorts of things that we should be thinking about. So we would definitely recommend thinking about a qualitative advanced phase. And we would also approach the research in a more iterative way, in that by way of an example, we found that people talked about technology a lot, but in a generic, technology term. And we would have been perhaps got some richer information if we put some probes in to ask people to then specify which technology, because that would have enabled us to, put some more granular information around what sorts of technology. So we perhaps could have picked that up from a qualitative phase, but we also could have been happy to adjust the chatbot as the study proceeded. And if we'd been a bit more iterative in our approach, we certainly could have done that. I'm not sure if you noticed that when we showed the screenshots of what the chatbot experience looked like, there was a little icon next to the comments that came from the chatbot. Some people didn't like the image that was, and they thought it wasn't business-like enough. Now, some options would be perhaps use the NewMR logo, or you might like to use a researcher's image. Martin will show us, after I finish this slide, a mock-up of what an alternative view of that could have been. One thing to keep in mind is we very much positioned this as an experiment. So people took part in it thinking it was a chatbot experiment, and probably many people took part in it out of curiosity to see what a chatbot experience was like in the research space. So that will have influenced some of the reaction to it and some of the data that we've collected. So any findings that we present should be, interpreted through that lens. One thing we do know is that the open ends that we got in this were very, very rich. But unlike Martin's project, we don't have a control cell to be able to say, we got more data, we got better data, but we feel like the verbatim comments were very rich. And another thing to keep in mind is, I think if you're designing one of these projects, is how familiar are your participants with interacting with an existing conversational user interface? Because, we kind of wonder if you're used to perhaps, online shopping, chatbot pops up, you ask the chatbot questions, the chatbot gives you answers. People who take part in those sort of interactions maybe find these sorts of research experiences more natural. or even people who are used to using chat functions in social media, their phone, it might be a more natural fit for some groups to move into chatbot research. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. And now Martin will show you perhaps an alternative way that you might like to lay out your chatbot experiment.
Yeah, so obviously bearing in mind what we've learned from this conversation, there's some quick wins that we could do in terms of if we were going to run this project again. First of all, obviously people mentioning that actually they would prefer to maybe see a human face. So, for example, there's this lovely Raybot here that maybe would add a bit more of a personal touch. So again, that's kind of one of the elements that we could have changed. Also, just making it perhaps a little bit more conversational. So some people were maybe hoping for a more, human-like interaction. So things like, for example, if someone mentioned automation, that we could actually look back on previous responses and say, well, actually, rather than just moving on to the next question, give some kind of reaction and follow-up to that. So whether, we reference the previous year's results or whether we kind of give some comment around that particular topic. But also, again, being able to, use the probing to look for more information. So, example, if someone mentions technology, perhaps then we could present a list of technologies in a more menu-driven option that could then get some kind of, metrics and data behind that in terms of the common technologies that people, believe are a real opportunity. So perhaps we could have mixed more qual and quant to get a kind of combination. But also maybe going more in depth in the probing. So when they've mentioned technology and then they've talked about AI, then maybe then go on to say, well, where exactly do you believe AI will have the biggest impact? And really going to that next level in terms of making it a deeper conversation and having that extra layer of interaction. So that's probably some of the areas that we would look at if we were to kind of do this project again. Back to you, Sue.
Okay, so in terms of some final recommendations, we would definitely recommend that you experiment with these now, because we're certainly going to see a lot more use of chatbots in research as we move forward. One big question you will need to think about if you start using chatbots is how important is legacy data to you, because it is a very different way of working. Now, some of you will have already explored this question a bit as you've thought about moving from telephone to online or online to mobile. We have been talking about legacy data a lot over the last few years, and we will continue to do so. How important is participant experience? We're seeing some initial indications here that these actually are improving participant experience. We will need to think about the balance between improving the experience with conditional probing and then the risk of that probing perhaps not being right and somebody feeling like that interaction had a flaw in it. And, there's a risk and reward kind of dimension to think about there. You do need to think about how you're going to process the data, because this is now taking you down a text route. So you're going to have to, plan how you're going to analyze it. Don't run a chatbot survey, chatbot experience, chatbot data collection exercise without thinking about what you're going to do with the data at the end. And remember, this is a space that is changing. In 12 months' time, things will be different. The platforms will get better. The analysis will get better. It will become easier. It will become faster. But on the flip side of that, the novelty value will be diminishing. Some people are going to find these really exciting in the short term, but then they will become more used to them. And if I can leave you with one final key point for today, chatbots are coming, whether you like it or not, and they're coming in the real world, not just in the market research world. So think about whether you should be experimenting with them now and get started on your chatbot journey. So we've now got time for questions for Martin and myself. So Martin, this first one's probably a great one for you to answer. How do chatbots handle typing errors or shortened forms of language and jargon?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways they can do that. So what we're able to do is actually we can do real-time spell checks. So we can actually correct or offer a correct option to the respondent and say, is this what you meant? So we can actually do that in order to be able to get more consistent data. Also in terms of things like slang, so actually the AI that we use is kind of very good in terms of understanding slang terms, sarcasm, sentiment. So actually it's being able to kind of pick up those types of things and understand whether people are talking positively or negatively. I think that's one of the things that we kind of didn't really touch on so far, is in terms of this particular scenario. It wasn't one where sentiment was massively expressed because we were framing the questions in a threats and opportunities way. So one of the ways that we'll often kind of probe or ask detailed questions is around the sentiment that's being expressed. So in this particular scenario, there wasn't a huge amount of sentiment being used, but obviously, part of that is being able to understand slang and sarcasm, which it's able to do.
Okay, here's one question about the comparison study, and just asking where you drew the participants for that study from. Was it a panel or something else?
Yeah, so we used a kind of a third party panel company who provided kind of the 500 respondents for the Wizu conversational survey and 500 other respondents for the traditional web. So they were kind of a broad, unbiased group that we gathered through a panel company.
Yeah. And I probably should mention, for anyone in the audience who's particularly interested in Martin and Wizu's comparison study, there is a white paper that you can download from the Wizu website, and we could probably put that up on the NewMR site as well, so that people can find that. So if you're after some of the extra detail there's a paper that accompanies that. And we will also be publishing a paper from this particular study, and you'll also notice that the slides we used tonight were a bit more wordy than we normally use, and that was so that these slides become a better reference document than presentation slides sometimes are. Now, Martin, I've got a few other questions, that come out of the various studies. One is, what was the termination rate for participants in the study? Was it higher or lower than a standard online survey?
Hi, Sue. Ray here. Probably easier that I tackle one or two of those, because I did most of the analysis of the data, and I can compare it with what we normally find in the NewMR studies.
Okay, super.
We're interviewing market researchers is probably the first comment. So this is a very special group of people. They have special characteristics. And one of the things is you need to be careful about what you mean by finishing properly. So we get a lot of people who look at the first page of a survey that NewMR run, and we've got one in the field at the moment using a conventional software, who then don't start. So we're going to largely ignore those. We get people who answer the last question, but who do not terminate the survey because they don't want to go to the landing page. So if we take those two out, then we would typically get 80% of people who answer the second question answering the last question. And we did slightly better on this. However, we got some negative comments on the first 20 or 30 interviews we collected, because we actually had more probing and we had a few places where it didn't quite fit. And so we streamlined it back. So yes, the termination, the successful completion to the end was very comparable, but a lot of the people who did this survey were market researchers who were looking to experience the process. So you can't draw too many conclusions. So Martin, in terms of your side-by-side comparison, do you have any feeling for what the completion rate was?
Yeah, so that particular scenario, because we were using panels, the completion rate wasn't really something that could be more comparable, because obviously when it's a panel audience, they're completing it, and so we were getting obviously significantly high completion rates. We have done other case studies with some actual live clients, and what we find is that we've got quite a few scenarios where people are getting 4 or 5 times an increase in completion rates. So there's a case study we did with the Dublin Bus Company, who were getting 25-30% completion rates through their traditional surveys, and through the Wizu platform, it was jumping up to kind of 75-80%. So we have found that on a more, the kind of typical customer survey type scenarios, that completion rates do significantly increase in those particular types of situations.
And one of the things to bear in mind with that is that typically the chatbot survey takes a little longer. So it is to do with the engagement and being relevant. It's not about making the whole thing faster.
Yeah.
Sue.
Okay, we've got more than one person has asked this question. And Martin, if you can tell us either for our study or for your general studies, people are curious of the balance between PC or computer completion versus mobile device completion. Do you sort of have a feel for that, how that specifically or generally breaks down?
So for this particular scenario, we do that data is available. I don't think it's a metric that we've looked at specifically for this experiment, but I'm sure we could pull out and share that data. Yeah, we tend to find that there is a larger percentage just universally across all server types that are using mobile. We're seeing pretty consistent completion rates across mobile and desktop. Our platform in particular is responsive so that it works differently on mobile and desktop to be optimal for that experience. But yeah, I don't have stats on this particular project to hand, but it's something we could pull together.
Yeah, Ray here. We will pull them out, but my recollection is that it's somewhere around, for our study, about 70% computer, which is absolutely typical for a NewMR study with market research audience. Market researchers tend not to do the survey on their mobile. That may be to do with the sort of people they are or where it is when they notice the invitation. But it's very different from standard consumer research, where we'll often see 50% be mobile.
Now, somebody is interested in what the output of the data looks like, and are asking for an example. That might be something that it might be best to perhaps work into the report. But Martin, if you felt like making any comments now, I know it's hard to describe sometimes what output and data looks like.
Well, just briefly, yeah. So in terms of, obviously, we're collecting kind of qualitative and quantitative. What we have is we have kind of dashboards and charts that will show you, trends over time, a kind of question by question breakdown in terms of the visuals. The open text side of things, so there's a couple of examples that I think Ray's going to pull out when he's looking at this particular study, but we have things like our text analytics reporting that will pick out common themes in terms of topics that people are talking about, the sentiment around that, common phrases that people are using to describe that, and there's also some visual ways of representing that. But yeah, just basically ways of kind of collating, particularly around the open text. The idea is, obviously, if we're collecting more open text data, we're doing some of that automated analysis and text analytics to be able to pull out the key trends around that.
Great. And there's another kind of group of questions that sort of fall into the same category. So I'll try and sort of summarize a few of them together. And it's really around people asking about how much of the sort of questions and probes are pre-programmed and how much is done on the fly. And then also this idea of what's the difference between conditional probing and, intelligence, if you like.
Yeah, so really you could build out 10 questions that are the same for everybody, or you could build out 100 questions that go down lots of different question paths. So you are essentially building a structured conversation where you say, these are the questions I want to ask. And the intelligent or conditional, I guess the way I would kind of separate them is, conditional might be something as simple as, if they mention this particular topic, I want to then ask this particular follow-up question. Whereas where the intelligence comes in is being able to understand things like the sentiment, the complexity of an answer, the topic that they're talking about, and being able to, then the bot is actually the one that's making that decision of, okay, so in that example we looked at earlier where someone just mentioned the word automation, clearly there the bot is looking at that and saying, okay, they've mentioned a topic that we're interested in, they haven't given a detailed answer, so I'm going to say, well, what about automation do you think is an opportunity, or whatever it might be. So that's where the intelligence comes in. So that's done on a kind of more of an individual question basis, where you'll say, on this question, I want to really probe their answer. So that's something that you can kind of have control of in terms of how complex you want to make that and where exactly that comes in. So you can keep that more structured, or it can branch off into different paths based on around those responses.
Okay, thanks very much, Martin. And we have now finished all of the audience questions. So that's fantastic. Thanks to everybody who chipped in with questions there. It's great to keep the conversation going. And big thank you to the audience for joining us once again. And we hope to see you at a NewMR event again soon. Bye for now.